Hello, Johannes Keating here. Most of us that practice some form of ISTDP or ISTDP-informed psychotherapy, we rely on interventions that are designed to increase intrapsychic tension and conflict towards the ultimate intrapsychic crises where the balance of power begins to shift and the healthy side dominates the avoidant resistant side. Lots and lots of what we do is designed to increase that intrapsychic tension. But that only works if the patient is aware of an internal conflict. If a patient is using splitting and projection, and they're primarily aware of an interpersonal conflict with you, the therapist, and they're primarily doing the problem as opposed to reflecting on the problem, then if we are relying on interventions designed to increase intrapsychic conflict, we end up just reinforcing and bolstering those very projections that actually have to be restructured and undone. This is quite a problem. All defenses have a relational component. They all have tentacles to the relational. So if someone engaged in self-criticism or self-attack, right, the relational implication is that they're in a one-down position, and that invites you to be in a one-up position, for example. So to stay with that example, okay, if the person doing it has a higher ego-adaptive capacity, they'll be able to reflect on the process. They'll be able to see that even though the therapist, you, might be reminding them of someone from their past, you're not actually them. And they're going to be much more readily aware when this is pointed out to them that they're being reminded, that they're superimposing a relational template on top of you, but it's really quite not the same as you, right? They'll be able to differentiate the past figure, the relational template, versus the undistorted therapist, the therapist as he or she is, okay? Whereas the person with lower ego-adaptive capacity, their reality testing might be much more compromised. The splitting and the projection might truly distort the therapist, distort reality in such a way that there is no distinction and differentiation in the patient's mind. So the reality testing here has become compromised. And so here, if the same person we're talking about who's self-critical and self-attacking, okay, here, instead of the relational dimension of it simply being a reminder, okay, the patient will pull for a reenactment, a relational reenactment, and begin to typically oscillate between relating to the therapist as if they were the parent and the therapist was the patient when they were a child. Alternatively, they will pull for the therapist to start to relate to them as they were a child back then, with the idea that the therapist embodies the way the parent was. So the relational implication with, say, self-attack, self-criticism, is the patient being in a one-down position. And then if the patient is pulling for a relational reenactment, that reenactment then needs the therapist to somehow step into the shoes of the parent who likely treated the child poorly in one form or fashion. So again, the person with lower ego-adaptive capacity, relying on more primitive regressive defenses, who engages in, say, self-criticism, that tends to be now in the service of trying to replicate and recreate a relational reenactment. Okay? So with people with lower ego-adaptive capacity, where the reality testing is much more compromised, there you'll see the far greater pull to recreate old relational dynamics that were typically rather unhealthy and certainly not very good for the patient. The person with the higher ego-adaptive capacity, the same relational implications are there with their defenses. If let's stay with self-attack, okay, it's there, but they're going to have reality testing, right? There's not going to be that same kind of pull for an actual relational reenactment where the conflict is between the therapist and the patient. There will be the ability to reflect on this, right? There won't be this doing the problem, acting the problem out. There will be the ability to reflect on the problem as an internal process. So let's add some meat to these ideas with an example. Let's think about a hypothetical client who at first glance might appear to have some capacity, because let's say they seem very intellectual. They cognize a lot and they talk about ideas a lot and so on and so forth. So that might give the impression, there's some capacity here. Not only that, there's a little bit of sighing left and right, but at a lower level of affect, you see some sighs. A little bit of pressure on feeling, and the patient actually gets dizzy. And later down the road, you realize there's also some access to paranoid ideation. And then you start seeing tendencies for the patient to be compliant. And you start seeing a lot of self-attack, self-criticism, self-loathing. And so here it's important to realize that you're dealing with someone with lower thresholds. So there's a lower ego-adaptive capacity. And to utilize interventions designed to increase intrapsychic conflict will reinforce projections. Because when you pull back the curtains, it becomes clear that the patient is actually trying to create an interpersonal conflict as a way of not looking at internal conflict. In this scenario, the defense of self-attack and the defense of compliance, they're in the service of trying to reenact an old pathological relationship. This is where it becomes important to be able to zoom out and see the bigger picture, that we're not just dealing with self-attack or compliance the way they might manifest in a patient with higher ego-adaptive capacity, where the patient doesn't lose the awareness that there's an internal conflict going on that needs to be addressed. Instead, with this lower ego-adaptive capacity patient that I'm trying to paint a picture of, okay, these defenses are in the service of trying to recreate an interpersonal enactment that will mirror a relationship that the patient had as a child with a parent or caretaker of sort. So to summarize, if we are relying on interventions designed to increase intrapsychic conflict and really mobilize the unconscious, then that presupposes that the client is experiencing at least a measure of internal conflict. But if they're relying on splitting and projection, if they're pulling for a reenactment and experiencing or trying to experience an interpersonal conflict with you instead, then we're only reinforcing the projections if we utilize those kinds of interventions designed to increase inner tension, inner conflict. And so the primary objective at this point is to simply undo the projections. And a final point to consider: if the patient is engaged in doing the problem more so than reflecting and thinking about the problem, if they're engaging in action speech rather than representational verbal speech, then our interventions have to match that. This is where you can't undo projections by asking for evidence. What's the evidence that I'm really like that? That would actually just reinforce the projections at this point with these kinds of patients. That would come across as defensive and sort of legalistic and lawyerly. This is where we can't, say, do a head-on collision in the hopes that that would create an intrapsychic conflict, because it all just gets filtered through these projections. And so here we can't try to, through logic or words, talk the patient into dropping their defenses. This is where we have to really be different from those projections. We have to render ourselves a target where those kinds of projections cannot stick. So if a patient is engaging in action language, they're doing the problem as opposed to reflecting on the problem, our interventions, our attempts to restructure and undo the projections, they can't really rely on the verbal side of things. You have to instead embody a way of being that is so different from the projections that those projections can't stick. That will be all for now. Until next time.